Lucille Garrett was used to the morning routine. Getting up early, she made coffee, listened to the radio, and watched the news on her phone. David usually woke up later, came down the stairs, and dropped a businesslike "good morning" without looking at her. These little things used to seem the norm. But lately, Lucille felt something imperceptible but weighty creeping into their daily lives. She noticed that David was staying late at work more and more often. The reasons for his absences sounded plausible. Important meetings, deadlines, client problems. But even his telephone voice was changing, more subdued when he spoke to her, and more casual when he was talking to someone else. Lucille didn't immediately begin to suspect infidelity, but one evening, while cleaning the kitchen, she heard him laugh while talking on the phone. It was the laugh he had once laughed with her. Lucille decided not to act impulsively. She knew that if she started to openly confront the relationship, it wouldn't lead to anything good, especially since David would never give her direct evidence. She began to look carefully at the phone calls, at his correspondence, at the way he left the house. Her patience bore fruit at another company party for the company where David worked. That evening, she came with him, listening to the standard compliments from his coworkers. They looked like a perfect couple. He in a strict suit, she in an elegant dress. But when Lucille noticed Bianca Holmes, she suddenly realized that her suspicions had a very definite face. Bianca was young, ambitious, with a bright smile and a confident look. Lucille watched her with interest, which she explained to herself by the desire to understand why her husband was so attracted to her. But everything became obvious when she noticed David furtively casting glances at Bianca, glances that had previously been reserved for her. The evening passed like a blur. Lucille kept smiling, keeping up conversations, feigning politeness, but caught every gesture and glance between David and Bianca. Everything was so veiled that an outsider would not have noticed anything suspicious, but not Lucille. She saw it, felt it, as if it were in the palm of her hand. After the party, Lucille did not give any sign that she had noticed anything. They got home, and as usual, David said he needed to check his mail before going to bed. She grinned to herself. Check the mail or Bianca? But all she said out loud was, "Sure, honey, don't be long." She decided to wait until there was more clear evidence. A few days later, Lucille found what she was looking for. His laptop, which David had left on the kitchen table, had an inbox open. She quickly flipped through the emails and came across correspondence with Bianca disguised as work messages. But just a few lines were enough to make everything clear. "I can't wait to see you on Friday. You promised to show me that place." The evidence was piling up. Lucille knew her suspicions were confirmed, but instead of anger or tears, she felt calm. The kind of calm that comes from a person who knows exactly what she's going to do next. A few days after that, Lucille met Bianca again at a corporate event, this time during a cocktail reception. David was somewhere nearby, but Lucille headed straight for the girl. "Bianca, right?" she asked, allowing herself a friendly smile. "Yes." Bianca looked up in surprise. "You're Lucille, right? David and I were talking about you once. He said you were a terrific hostess." Lucille nodded briefly. Terrific hostess. Now at least it was clear what her husband was talking about with his mistress. Yes, she said quietly. "Well, I'm glad David thinks so. Listen, Bianca, I wanted to ask you, you haven't been with the company that long, have you? How's the job treating you?" Their conversation was friendly and casual, but Lucille's every phrase sounded like a test. She caught every word Bianca said, every detail. When Bianca told her how much she enjoyed working with David, her eyes shone too brightly. At that moment, Lucille finally lost her desire to play by the rules. When she returned home, she knew this wasn't just a fling. It was something more. Perhaps Bianca was even hoping for a future with David. Lucille decided to take action, but not like many in her position, not with a fight, threats, or even a divorce. She wanted Bianca to regret ever having met David in the first place. Lucille had never considered herself a woman capable of crime, but she never thought her life would turn into such a farce as this marriage. Her plan was slowly coming together like a jigsaw puzzle, carefully, methodically, and coldly. That night, when she'd first felt the real urge to do something to eliminate Bianca, thoughts of how wrong it was hadn't crossed her mind. Everything seemed logical. So, she began to plan. First was to determine the vulnerability of the victim. Bianca was a person of habits, which played into Lucille's hands. She found out that the girl drove to work every day on a scenic winding road outside the city to avoid morning traffic jams. The route went through the woods and included several sharp turns. The terrain was considered dangerous, especially in winter when the road was covered in ice. But according to Bianca, it was the perfect way to be alone with your thoughts before starting your workday. Lucille smiled ironically at the thought that such a quiet route might be the girl's last. She began by systematically following Bianca, not hiding, but not raising suspicion either. She accidentally found herself in the same cafe, where she usually took coffee to go, noticed her car in the parking lot near the fitness club, which Bianca visited 3 times a week. Soon Lucille knew what time she left and returned, what parking spaces she preferred. Now all that was left was to find a way to fake an accident. Realizing that she couldn't mess with Bianca's brakes herself, Lucille decided to turn to an old acquaintance of her younger brother, Johnny Martin, who had once been an auto mechanic, but now specialized in home car repair, which of course included less legal services. They hadn't spoken to Johnny in 10 years, but Lucille knew his reputation was still the same, a guy who could be paid to turn a blind eye to nuances. They met in a small bar on the outskirts of town, where an old record player blasted the blues, and the waitress looked at the customers, as if each of them owed her a personal apology for their life decisions. Johnny was still the same, a little grayer, but he kept his casual demeanor as if life had never really touched him. "Lucy!" he shrieked, stretching into a smile as she approached the counter. "Wow! Who would have thought it? What brings you here to my humble domain?" "Your professional endorsement," Lucille replied with a slight chuckle, sitting down on a high chair. "Need a small favor related to the car." Johnny frowned, his gaze becoming more focused. "A small favor, or highly illegal?" Lucille allowed herself a slight nod. "Let's say I need one car's brakes to fail at the worst possible moment." Johnny leaned back in his chair, his face a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Damn it, Lucy. You're not kidding, are you? Has someone seriously crossed your path?" "You could say that," she said coldly, without going into details. "Do you agree or not?" He was in no hurry to answer, and Lucille felt her patience begin to wear thin. She knew it was a risk, but her confidence that she would make it clean only grew stronger with every second of Johnny's silence. "Okay," he said at last. "But I want payment up front and assurances that no trace of me will be left behind. The car has to be somewhere where it can be easily fixed, and I'll still be on the other side of town." They talked over the details. Lucille agreed to give him the money through a mutual acquaintance so as to leave no trace, and to determine when and where Bianca would leave the car in the parking lot. The best place turned out to be a parking lot near the fitness club, where the security cameras covered only the entrance, leaving the back of the parking lot out of sight. The deal was done, and Lucille felt like she'd managed to cross the threshold of no return. All that was left to do was wait for it to happen. A few days later, Lucille returned to the parking lot outside the fitness club where Bianca had parked her car. This moment was crucial to her. She had studied the girl's car in advance, and even knew where to discreetly attach a small GPS sensor to track her movements. Lucille had carefully thought everything through. She had ordered the device online and received it at the post office under a false name. Details were important. She couldn't afford any mistakes. The parking lot was practically empty. Lucille parked on the far corner, and after waiting a couple minutes for passers-by to disappear from view, approached Bianca's silver SUV. Sitting down next to it, as if adjusting her shoelaces, she discreetly attached a GPS sensor under the rear bumper. It only took a few seconds, and at first glance her actions wouldn't have attracted any attention. Now she had a way to track Bianca's route in real time. Lucille returned to the car, and after hesitating for a moment, texted Johnny, "All set, you can get started." Johnny replied a few hours later, "Done, without too much fuss." He damaged the brake system so that the problem wouldn't show up right away. It would work on a steep downhill where the brakes would be useless. Lucille went on with her normal life. She went to meetings, had dinner with David, discussed the latest news with her friends, but all the while she kept tabs on Bianca through a GPS tracking app. She knew the girl regularly traveled the winding road outside of town, and her route remained steady. Impatience was starting to build, however. One day David mentioned that Bianca hadn't gotten to work. Something's got a cold. Lucille took this as an unfortunate delay. The plan needed execution, and the delay was irritating, but her patience was soon rewarded. Early in the morning, as she was preparing breakfast, her phone vibrated. A signal from the GPS sensor told her that Bianca's car had started moving. Lucille knew that today the girl would take her usual route. This day could be the last day of her life. To look completely unattached, Lucille had arranged in advance to meet her friend at a cafe in the city center. While they discussed the latest purchases and life events, Lucille occasionally checked the time. She couldn't afford to openly follow the news, but waited for the right moment to arrive. Later, when they said goodbye, Lucille turned on the radio to hear possible mentions of traffic accidents. She didn't know if her plan had worked, but a gut feeling told her that something had to happen today. All that was left was to follow the developments and be ready for the denouement she had planned down to the smallest detail. The fatal accident happened as planned at the end of a long day's work as Bianca was returning home along her usual route. Outside of town, the roads began winding through the woods, where each turn hid another steep descent or ascent. Lucille knew this route like the back of her hand. She'd even driven it a couple times in recent weeks to assess the potential risks. The road was perfect for her plan, narrow and dangerous enough that any mistake could be fatal. Bianca drove quietly, taking her time. She was tired after a long day at work and hoped that by the time she reached home, she would be able to get some more rest while dinner was cooking in the multi-cooker. Her thoughts were wandering. She was listening to the radio when the car started acting strangely. At one corner, the brake pedal seemed soft, almost without resistance. Bianca pressed it harder, but the car didn't slow down. She tried to slow down by downshifting, but it wasn't enough. The SUV was steadily gaining speed, and there was another tight turn ahead. Her heart raced, and the thought flashed through her mind. No, 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 not again. She pressed desperately on the brakes, but all she got was to hear a low, pitiful squeak under the hood. The car wouldn't obey, and a moment later her wheels went off the road. It flew into a ditch and slammed into a tree with such force that the metal panels crumpled like foil. It happened so fast that Bianca didn't even have time to scream. When the car came to a stop, there was silence in the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the red-hot engine. The windshield was shattered, the airbags didn't deploy, and Bianca was left sitting motionless. Blood slowly dripped down her face, staining the steering wheel and dashboard. There was no more life in her body. Lucille, being in a meeting with her friend at that moment, had no idea that the accident had already happened. She had been following the developments through the GPS sensor, which showed that Bianca's car had suddenly stopped halfway down the road. Lucille tried not to give the appearance of being bothered by this, pretending to listen to her friend. Her thoughts wandered, but her face retained its usual expression of calm. News of the incident came a few hours later. David was the first to call Lucille. There was a panic in his voice that he rarely allowed himself to show. "Lucille, it's Bianca. She's had an accident. Shit, she's..." His voice trailed off. Lucille listened to him, pretending to be shocked. She feigned shock, despair, regret, whatever was needed. How did it happen? Her voice sounded restrained but sympathetic. Are you okay? What did the doctors say?" No, he said, choking on his own words. "She's dead. Bianca's dead." It was at that moment that Lucille allowed herself a brief pause, as if digesting what she had heard before answering. She closed her eyes and exhaled quietly, as if trying to hold herself together. "God," she muttered. "This is awful. I don't even know what to say. I'm with you, David." When the conversation was over, Lucille sank into the chair, feeling a rush of satisfaction. Everything had gone as planned. No unnecessary questions, no unforeseen difficulties. That evening, she and David sat in silence at home, and he held a glass of whiskey in his hands, as if he were trying to hold on to it to keep from falling into the abyss of his emotions. Lucille feigned concern without being overly supportive. She knew that if she started to comfort too actively, it would look suspicious. A few days later, at David's workplace, they began to discuss the accident. Colleagues were shocked by what had happened. One coworker recalled how Bianca had recently complained about something strange in her car's behavior, but no one paid much attention to it. Now that she was gone, everyone was wondering if something could have been done in advance to prevent the crash. While the discussions and rumors hung in the air, Lucille continued to feign involvement and concern. She supported her husband, saying the right things without doing too much. With each passing day, her confidence only grew. She had managed to make it look like a terrible accident rather than a murder. On the third day after the accident, the police announced that there would be an investigation to find out exactly what had happened on that curve. It was standard procedure in such cases, but it still made Lucille feel slightly uneasy. She knew that an inspection of the car might reveal signs of sabotage, but she hoped that the damage from the collision with the tree would mask any clues. The rumors among her colleagues continued to grow, however, and eventually they reached David. One of Bianchi's acquaintances, a car mechanic by trade, once quipped that things like this shouldn't happen for no reason, referring to brake failure. It wasn't a serious accusation, but it still awakened suspicions that began to hang in the air. Meanwhile, Lucille continued to play her part. She knew that the success of her plan depended on how convincingly she could portray shock and grief. So she tried to act like someone who is always there to support, but doesn't pry too deeply into someone else's pain. She spoke to David about Bianca only when he initiated the conversation, and did not allow herself a single word that might sound strange or hint at her involvement. Inside, however, Lucille felt triumphant. She checked the news, looking for mentions of the investigation, and saw that the police had so far found no signs of interference. Everything looked like a classic case of tragic accident. Even so, she knew she had to be prepared for any turn of events. In the last few days, when it had become known that the experts would still be scrutinizing the braking system of Bianchi's car, Lucille had remained calm. She reminded herself that there should be no direct trace of her involvement. Even if the police did find something, she assured herself that it couldn't be linked to her. Detectives Jason Carter and Naomi Harris had received the case of Bianca Holmes's death as a routine accident investigation. The report stated that the girl's car veered off the road and hit a tree as she was returning from work. At first glance, everything pointed to loss of control and brake failure. For most, that would be a sufficient explanation. But to Jason, who had seen a lot of strange cases in his 20-year career, it all seemed too simple. "You know I don't believe in coincidences, Naomi," he said, standing over the wrecked SUV in the police parking lot. A car with a perfect service history, a conscious and sober driver, and suddenly the brakes fail? "I don't like this." Naomi stood nearby, examining the dents in the hood. She was younger than Jason, but she'd already developed a reputation as a meticulous detective who noticed the little things that eluded others. Maybe it was an unfortunate accident, or someone decided that a crash was the most convenient way to get rid of the problem, she said, as if continuing her partner's thought. Her gaze fell on the torn brake hose that the mechanics had found when they inspected the car. The technical examination had confirmed their worst fears. The brake hose had been damaged intentionally. The cut was smooth, made with a sharp tool. There was no doubt about it. Someone had tampered with the system to create an accident. The next day, they started interviewing people who knew Bianca. There were more and more suspects with each new conversation. Colleagues mentioned some strained relationships at work. Neighbors recalled strange visitors seen outside her apartment, and rumors of a certain lover who began to appear in her life. One of the firm's employees, whom the detectives invited to speak to them, immediately caught their attention with his nervous demeanor. Clyde Williams, a middle-aged manager, sat across from Jason and Naomi, rubbing his hands together and avoiding a direct look. "You said you knew Bianca well?" Jason began, not taking his eyes off his companion. "Well, yes. We worked together. Sometimes she helped with projects." Clyde looked like he wanted to say something else, but didn't dare. "Did she have, close relationships with anyone in the office?" Naomi asked the question with a slight hint to test his reaction. Clyde hesitated for a moment before answering. "Well, I once—" He hesitated, as if searching for words. "I caught her in David's office. It was after hours, and they both looked like, you know." He glanced at the detectives, trying to gauge how they'd take his confession. "What exactly did you see, Mr. Williams?" Naomi leaned a little closer to show that she was expecting specifics. They were together. He lowered his voice. She was sitting on the edge of his desk and, well, there was an off-duty discussion, if I may say so. "And why didn't you report it right away?" Jason asked, noticing Clyde's nervous shrug. "Honestly, I was hoping that I could—" Clyde faltered, realizing that this confession might make him look bad. "I thought I could use this information to bargain for a promotion. Well, you know, I was one of the candidates for the top job. I thought if it all came out, it would be good for me." Naomi and Jason exchanged glances. They now had a witness confirming that Bianca and David had a relationship, and his confession was adding a new line of inquiry. David turned out to be the type who tried to appear composed, but it was obvious he was heartbroken. This was a man used to controlling his emotions, but the detectives were no novices and knew how to recognize falsity. Jason could see David's eyes darting around the room as he answered their questions. He did his best to appear like a normal man who had lost a close friend, but refused to talk about how he and Bianca were anything more than co-workers. "Tell me, Mr. Garrett, when was the last time you saw Bianca?" Jason asked, watching his reaction carefully. "The day of the accident. We talked a little at work, as usual. Nothing out of the ordinary." His voice sounded confident, but the tension in his eyes spoke volumes. Naomi continued. "Colleagues said you often stayed late at work together. Did she help you with projects?" "Yes, we worked on several projects together. Bianca was a great professional." David put emphasis on professionalism, which sounded too emphatic. After talking to David, Naomi and Jason discussed his behavior. "He's too cautious," Naomi remarked. "It's like he knows we might have questions, or he's hiding something. Maybe, but right now I'm more interested in his wife. I've heard she's been acting too quiet," Jason said, opening Lucille Garrett's file. Lucille was exactly as the witnesses had described her, polite, calm, reserved. She made no dramatic statements, no attempt to draw attention to herself. It seemed she was really trying to support her husband during this difficult time, but the detectives found her calmness strange. When they invited her to the interview, she showed up in a perfectly tailored outfit, with discreet makeup. Lucille held herself with dignity, but there was no shadow of alarm in her eyes. "We know your husband had a close relationship with Bianca Holmes," Jason began, trying to elicit a reaction from her. "They were co-workers. Sometimes that can bring people closer together than you'd like," Lucille replied without blinking an eye. Naomi interjected, "Did you know they were more than co-workers? I saw that they got along well. Anything that happened outside the office was their business." Her voice sounded flat, like she was discussing the weather forecast. The detectives had gotten nothing from Lucille that indicated she was involved. However, the longer the conversation went on, the more the feeling grew that she was hiding something. Her restraint seemed too perfect. At this time, new clues began to be added to their picture. While examining Bianca's car, witnesses recalled seeing a certain man rummaging through the car in the parking lot outside the health club a few days before the accident. He was described as medium height, slightly balding, with dirty clothes. Jason immediately noted that the description matched the characteristics of the man one of Lucille's former friends had mentioned, Johnny Martin, an old acquaintance of her family. Naomi decided that they should look into any possible connections Johnny had with Lucille to see if he could have helped her sabotage the car. She also noticed that Jason was clinging tenaciously to the theory that Lucille was involved and decided to keep up. "Do you think she's capable of that?" she asked. "I think she has too much control over her emotions." "That's suspicious," Jason replied, pursing his lips. Naomi nodded. She, too, sensed that Lucille knew more than she was saying. Detectives Jason Carter and Naomi Harris knew that the time for the final act of the investigation was approaching. All the pieces of the puzzle were slowly beginning to fit together. The sabotage of Bianchi's braking system had been intentional, and now it remained to prove who exactly was behind it. The evidence was leading to Lucille Garrett, but they needed more facts to make the final move. The first real breakthrough was that Jason and Naomi had found a connection between Lucille and Johnny Martin, the man seen outside Bianca's car. Johnny was an old acquaintance of her younger brother, and they had shared a car repair company a few years ago. Moreover, it turned out that Johnny had worked for a while at the auto repair shop that Lucille had visited with the car just a few months ago. These circumstances didn't look too convincing on their own, but the detectives had enough reason to delve into the details. On closer inspection, they discovered that on the day before the accident, Lucille had visited a restaurant near the fitness club parking lot where Bianca's car was usually parked. Surveillance cameras recorded her car in the parking lot, although she claimed to have spent the entire time with a friend on the other side of town. Now her alibi looked dubious. Naomi didn't allow herself to jump to any premature conclusions, but something told her that Lucille was feeling a little too confident in her role as supportive wife. She decided to check another possibility and suggested that Jason go back for a closer look at Lucille's garage. The garage turned out to be a veritable repository of small details that usually don't attract attention unless you know what to look for. Naomi found a toolbox of tools that had clearly been recently used. The condition of several wrenches and pliers made her wary. One of the tools had small traces of grease that could match the grease found on Bianca's brake system. "Looks like we got something here," Naomi said, holding the tool at arm's length. Jason stepped closer and frowned. "Do you think this is it?" "Well, even if it's not direct evidence, it certainly suggests that she might have had access to a substance like this," Naomi said. It was clear to Jason that all of this couldn't be ignored. The experts were going to analyze the traces of lubricant they'd found. If the match was confirmed, it would be another link in the chain of evidence against Lucille. In the meantime, they also received a surveillance tape that could be a decisive argument. The tape showed Lucille's car pulling into the parking lot outside the health club the day before the accident. It had been parked there long enough to attract attention, especially since Lucille claimed she hadn't been there that day. With this new evidence, Jason and Naomi decided to bring Lucille in for a second interview to see how she would react to more direct accusations. Lucille walked into the office with an expression of quiet dignity, as if she was confident that she could emerge victorious from any situation. She smiled when she spotted Jason and Naomi and sat down across from them. "Detectives, we've been talking, and I thought we were done here," she began with a touch of irritation in her voice. "You know that we are still checking the information," Naomi answered without looking at Lucille's eyes. She was studying the papers on the table. "We found something interesting CCTV footage. It shows that your car was in the parking lot of the fitness club where Bianca was parked, the day before the accident." Lucille raised her eyebrows. "Yeah, it's possible. I was in the neighborhood meeting a friend. Maybe I stopped by for a minute. I don't remember exactly." "So what? That makes me a murderer?" "It makes your alibi questionable," Jason interjected. "And we got something else. The grease marks on the tools in your garage match the ones found on Bianca's damaged brake system." Lucille froze for a second, but quickly pulled herself together. "Look, it's all a bunch of crap. I didn't do anything to Bianca's car," she declared. A note of panic began to creep into her voice, but she tried to hold it back. Naomi leaned forward. "We know you know Johnny Martin. He was spotted near Bianca's car shortly before the accident, and he's connected to you through your brother. Do you have anything to say about that?" Lucille tried to remain calm, but her hands were visibly shaking. Johnny's just an acquaintance. He had nothing to do with this. You're trying to accuse me of something I didn't do." The detectives continued to ask questions, and Lucille grew increasingly nervous. She tried to parry each statement, but the evidence was starting to add up, and it was getting harder and harder for her to justify herself. Naomi took the final step. "We know you set up this accident, Lucille. Your calmness after Bianca's death, your sudden interest in chance, encounters near her car, the traces of lube and the camera footage all prove that you carefully planned her murder to disguise it as an accident. But what you didn't take into account was that the truth always comes out." Lucille closed her eyes, her shoulders slumped. She didn't say a word, but it was clear without further admission. Her carefully thought-out plan was falling apart, and this time she would not escape the consequences. When Lucille was arrested, she didn't resist. Her gaze was blank, and perhaps deep down she had long ago realized that her scheme was doomed to failure. David sat in the semi-dark room, reading for the umpteenth time the message from Naomi Harris that had arrived in his email. It contained a dry statement of fact. Lucille had been arrested for the murder of Bianca Holmes. The evidence was strong enough for a trial, and the investigation had determined that she had deliberately faked the accident. Detectives discreetly described the chain of events that led to the tragedy, but could say nothing about what was going through his wife's mind when she decided to do the deed. David could not come to his senses. He didn't know what he was feeling: fear, anger, frustration, all mixed together in a tight knit. He couldn't believe that the man he'd lived with for decades was capable of such a thing. "But didn't you know?" sounded some mocking voice inside him. He tried to find signs by which he could guess that Lucille was cooking something like this. But how? She'd been there for him, pretending to support him after Bianca's death, cooking dinners, remaining as collected and confident as ever. On the day of the trial, he was in the courtroom. His presence here seemed strange to him, as if he were watching it all from the outside. Lucille sat on the dock, dressed in a restrained gray suit, with no extra emotion on her face. There was something strange in her gaze, a mixture of weariness and cold calm, as if she had long ago accepted the inevitable. The trial lasted several weeks. Prosecutors consistently presented the facts, citing forensics and camera footage, witness testimony, and of course the most important evidence, the marks on the tools they found in the garage. Lucille did not plead guilty. She claimed that she never plotted anything against Bianca, and called the evidence found a coincidence. But her defense sounded unconvincing, as if she didn't believe in her own words. The sentence was harsh: 25 years in prison without parole. The moment the judge read the judgment, David felt nothing. It was some strange vacuum that pulled all emotion out of him. He looked at Lucille, but he didn't see in front of him the woman he had once married. After the trial, he didn't go near her. He simply walked away without turning around. Lucille glimpsed him but didn't say a word. After a few months, David could not finally accept that all this had happened to him. He quit his job and moved to another city, away from places that reminded him of the past. From time to time, he heard from acquaintances about the progress of Lucille's appeal, but he never went to the hearing. One day, going through the mail, he found a letter from her. It was short, written in neat handwriting, as Lucille always did, saying that she wanted to keep him safe from the man who was destroying their marriage. She didn't apologize, didn't try to justify herself. She simply explained that it was the only way for her to save everything they had. David read the letter several times and then tore it up and threw it away. He realized that he could feel nothing for this woman. No hate, no pity, not even regret. It was all behind him, just like the life he no longer had. The story ended quietly, without a flashy ending and without pathos. Lucille went to prison, where many years awaited her. David went on with his life, trying to move forward, but every time he passed by the woods or saw a winding road, he involuntarily remembered the day it all began.